You know, these are really hard days for conversations. A lot of conversations could be had these days that are just avoided. Usually hard topics, polarizing topics, divisive topics, racial topics, pandemic topics. And what I have found is that usually when we avoid hard conversations, it's because we're kind of staying in a head zone where we want to be right. We have narratives, perceptions, opinions. We kind of want others ideally to join the way we think. What I have found is that when conversations can shift out of that head zone where we tend to be kind of defensive and protective into a heart zone where human empathy and connection and appreciation and understanding happen more easily, people start to bond. People start to bond over hard stuff that might keep them apart. And most of my experience is in the realm of criminal justice. So what we're going to kind of get into a little bit with a PowerPoint is how restorative justice provides an alternative way to bring a deeper justice between people. But it all applies to conflicts and divisive issues. Everything I'm saying about going from the head zone to the heart zone is really the secret to helping people cross the divides, whether it's a crime or a mistrusting relationship in a workplace or an extended family member or friend that you might feel a little alienated from. The question is, how do conversations go into the heart space? Because that's where shift happens. I hope you heard that right. Shift happens in the heart zone. And that's really essential for coexistence, where people can imagine living together, having futures together, where they're just more trusting. I think I just need to tell a story, because without a story, we sometimes wonder, what's this all about? But, like a picture's worth 1,000 words. So I'm going to tell a story. It'll be a criminal case. Is it Marshall? I just want you all to know that Marshall also has a story. And I don't know if we can honor the time today, but there are lots of stories. We all have stories that have to do with hard conversations and healing and redemption, whether we know it or not. And maybe some of them are failed stories. They're still stories. And so to tell the stories is just a really important way to understand the power of this work. And theologically, God's medium of preference is story. Right? So we're in a good zone when we're talking about story. This is about two young men who actually burnt down a church not too far from here, probably 2 hours into Wisconsin. They did not intentionally burn down the church. It was not arson, but they were part of a whole string of burglaries that happened over a month, where they were busting into places. They were looking for sellable metals like copper, but they would take like electronic stuff, and eventually they got caught. But one of the places they busted into at night was this rural Lutheran church, and they had lit some candles in the front of the sanctuary to kind of see what they might take. One guy had a habit of knocking stuff over just to kind of work out his anger. And anyways, long story short, they took what they wanted. They left to go out to a shed in the parking lot, took some more stuff, drove away, and one of those candles that got knocked over hit some flammables, and the whole church burnt down to the foundation. I mean, can you imagine this church like a cement foundation? And the congregants, a lot of them were elderly folk who had been baptized in that church. Deep connection. So these two young men ended up probably doing about 12 months in jail as the courts was deciding what they could do. And because of the Restorative Dialogue program that I managed as a nonprofit in the county, the pastor knew about my program, and he said, you know, I think we would really like to be part of some deep conversation around this. Our congregants are really hurting, and they know a bit about the possibility of dialogue. So they actually influenced a judge who allowed that to be part of the sentencing. So during the jail time, I would go into the jail and do preparatory time with these two guys, and we would do storytelling. We would talk about ownership. We would talk about their capacity for empathy. We would envision reparations that were meaningful. It's like priming the pump, opening up their imaginations to a justice that's not just pain for pain, but where can some life come out of this tragedy? So I probably met with each of them about 4 times. I'm also, with another facilitator, meeting with the church folk, and there's 8 congregants. So just imagine like 8 of you coming together, once a month on a journey of talking about your losses, grieving, but also preparing to meet with these 2 young men someday with their parents. Eventually, they get out of jail, and we have a couple joint meetings. The first one is about 4 hours long. We have a lunch break time, and these are sacred moments. I tell people, don't plan anything else that day. It's like a Saturday. This is a really sacred thing. This is not just a next thing you kind of fit into the day. This is something really to honor and prepare for. And we got about an hour into the meeting. I'm facilitating it. People are sitting in a circle. There's probably about 15 people in the room. And we get about an hour into the meeting, and one of the women in the church looks to the young man and says, we're very thankful you're here. And we know you're being open and honest. You've told us, what you've done. This is all good. But we lost a lot here, and we just need more. We need to really know what was going on for you. Why did you do this? What's going on in your life? We need to make better sense out of this. And sometimes people who are victimized, they need what I called earlier the verbal gifting so that they're satisfied. And the satisfaction hadn't happened yet. So that prompt allowed those 2 young men to be more real and vulnerable, not just say expected things. And one of them started talking about his tour in Iraq. He said, I was a soldier in Iraq, and it was hard. And when I got back, the military gives you all this money, and I partied it away, and I got back into my drug habits. When I ran out of money, I had to kind of sustain my drug habits. And there's plenty of seats over here, friends. And he talked about some of the trauma that he experienced. And when he got done with his bit of sharing, one of the older men in the church said, I know a bit about what you're saying. I got a nephew who came back from Iraq. Welcome, friends. I got a nephew who came back from Iraq. He committed suicide. So I know a bit about what you're saying. Can you feel the bridge that happens when that happens? And then the other guy starts talking, and he says, I went to middle school and high school in this community, and as a half Native American, half Latino in a mainly white area, I was always the one who ended up in the principal's office, and it just didn't seem fair to me. Like, how come no one else ever came, why was it just me? And that bothered me. And so when I got out of high school, I just had this anger, and that's why I knock over things every time I go into these burglary settings. And he narrated, he's just being real. That's how he accounted for getting back to the community. And when these guys were done with just kind of going deeper, you could feel like something deep and sacred was going on. And one of the women in the church looks at him and says, let me tell you guys something. We all come to church every Sunday and we say this prayer together. And in that prayer, there's a phrase, forgive us as we forgive others. And now that you've come to be with us, tell us, what you've done, and you're being honest. We appreciate that. We want to forgive you today. And those guys really were speechless. You could tell they really didn't know what to say, but they were thankful. And shift happened at that point. If you're new walking in here, earlier I said shift happens. And I made sure people heard that right. And that's because it happens when people bond with just being real about their stories, and they're giving something to the other that really no one else can give unless they come together. I mean, Jacob and Esau ultimately have to come back together if they're going to put to rest the negative electrical energy between their brotherhood. Remember, Esau said, I'm going to kill you. Jacob leaves for 21 years. He has to come back and have a little bit of wrestling before he gets reconciled to his brothers. So these powerful shifts can happen, but it has to be dyadically together, and yet facilitators hold space for that to happen. We can't expect harming and harmed people to just come together and kind of hope for the best. So as a facilitator, that's kind of my trade. I hold space where other people do the work of sharing deeply, having ownership, expressing empathy, talking about their impacts, whatever it takes, so that people get a shared narrative of something that happened that allows them to move forward, and then they can talk about a future together. Then they can talk about, okay, what do we really need to do to rebuild trust and make amends? And these guys had harmed a lot of farmers in the area. They had to do restitution along with it. But can you see how their motivation now to do practical restitution comes out of a relational context? It's not just a judge saying, do this, which is a good thing to do. But now they have a relational bond with people that they've spoken to, which deepens their respect for each other. And now they have a motivation to make things right. And that really is the key to restorative justice. It's justice that makes things right. Theologically, that's what redemption is all about. Rebuild a relationship, and then you can work at things. I'm going to show a PowerPoint real soon, but I kind of always like to honor a question. So I can wait. Let's hear it. Then I don't have to do so much talking.
I'd like to know what the response of the young men were to the gift of forgiveness that they received. I'm not hearing what they were giving back.
Yeah, thanks. I kind of shortened the story, but they were very thankful. They were speechless. They felt like they weren't deserving of a response like that, and they were very touched. And we still had another hour and a half of conversation after that. So. Can I ask a question? Absolutely. I love questions.
Maybe I missed something, but I heard that their anger was what other people had done to them. What about the people who had done something to them, asking for forgiveness of them?
So she's really asking, where does their anger come from? What about the people that did stuff to them? So you're insightfully bringing up the fact that crimes and harms don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in systems with conditions. Now and then I go into prisons, and I'm sure Marshall could testify to this. There's no one in prison that doesn't have a backstory of victimization. You understand that? There is no one who makes bad, violent, or disrespectful choices that doesn't have a backstory of victimization. So that just means there's wider, deeper conversations and healing that could happen in a community. Now, I also bring this work into churches where there might not be a crime, but there might be a conflict or grudges or alienation. So the same kind of powerful work can also happen in churches. And that's a little bit what my 2-page handout kind of gets to. But I need to kind of go through a PowerPoint just to give you a little more theory and education, and then we'll come back, open it up for a little more questions and maybe your comments and some other ways to keep learning. So here's just some more pictures of folks coming together for dialogue, often sitting in a circle. This has a police officer right in there who can talk about safety factors. This is more of an adult group, but since the 90s, it's really gone into schools as a discipline alternative or suspension alternative. Keep the kids in school learning and connecting. There's a prison group there. It doesn't necessarily have to be addressing an incident. It could just be talking about everyone's life experiences that have to do with harming and harm. That's a church group there, and this is part of where my work goes, where churches can either address a real issue in a circle fashion, or maybe they can just do some community building and get to know each other better. In the old days, we always had tables. Nowadays, we just do circles without tables, but sometimes people feel a little safer with a table. Same principles in South Africa in the 90s with Desmond Tutu. He kind of brought in some pioneering restorative theory with Zulu tradition in order to heal issues at a very high societal level. This is a Gagaka court in Rwanda that's also restorative after the Hutu-Tutsi violence. They would have people share their stories of being harmed or harming, and the whole village, you can see, vicariously takes this in as a way for them, because everyone in this picture probably has family members who were murdered. So they all need it. They all need something powerful to go through. Joe Barry and Pat McGee, Ireland. Pat McGee is a Brighton bomber who set off a bomb in a hotel in southern England, tried to kill Margaret Thatcher back in the 80s. Joe's father was a dignitary, one of several people killed in that bombing. She wanted to have restorative connection with him, and over a long period of preparation, they actually had deep healing conversation, and they actually tour together and tell their stories together. So here's some theory. The way I look at it is crime or harm sets negatives in motion, like ripple effects, creating disruption, disconnection, distrust. And therefore, justice should set positives in motion, should reverse things, creating peace, connection between people, and all of that. What a shame if our justice system creates more disruption, more disconnection, more alienation, because people are kept separate. People in prisons don't really know how their actions have affected others. Victims can get stuck and trapped in their role without really having their deepest needs met. I love this Navajo word, bihazani, from an article that Judge Robert Yazzie wrote. Life comes from it. Life comes from it. It's a beautiful term because this is the kind of justice we want, where justice is shalom, order building, making things right. If I have to give an elevator speech for restorative justice, I just say two things. It focuses mostly on the harm done rather than the law broken. And that doesn't mean the law is not important, because we need laws, we need boundaries, rules, but it focuses mostly on the harm done to people. And it engages those people as best as possible rather than just leaving it to professionals. Once you focus more on the harm and have a commitment to engage those who are primarily involved in a crime, you have to have communication processes that connect them. It just kind of goes together, because they have to talk about it. They have to connect. They have to maybe coexist and not live in a troubled way. And I know victims even of murder cases who said, I had to do this because I needed to sleep better. I had to do it for myself because I just needed to have a new life. And so there's self-interest, definitely self-interest in this, but it's good self-interest that links the needs of both parties together in a dyadic way so their needs are met. Howard Zehr is kind of a pioneering figure in this movement, one of my mentors. Restorative justice requires at minimum that we address victims' harms and needs, hold offenders accountable to put right those harms, and involve victims, offenders, and communities in this process. Communities of support, trained facilitators, resource people. You know, communities are in this same game too. We all hear politicians saying, well, we got to be harder on crime, which usually means tougher sentencing, don't give supports. Have you ever heard a politician say, we got to be softer on crime? That's the negative, right? There's a fallacy in this debate, and I don't know if you can see it by the arrows, but it presumes that accountability and support work inversely to each other. Why the heck can't we have both? Why can't there still be high accountability that's meaningful, life-giving, and dignify offenders so that they're held positively responsible to step up to the plate and be right in there to make things right? This is the essence of good parenting, right? You love the heck out of your kids, and you stay consistent to clear boundaries. And if you don't have both together, usually kids will figure that out and know how to take control. These are 4 models, dialogue models, that have kind of stood the test of time in the modern context. Of course, it's really important to say that indigenous traditions, without maybe this language, have been doing this work for centuries, because village cultures have to have people restored. They all have roles, and they're all important. And so there's wisdom to indigenous justice traditions. But these are standard models. I do trainings and conference and circle and a blended model, if you ever want it. Even in this church, have like a 1 or 2 day training. That's the work I do for my living. I like this synergy of sharing, listening, and being heard, because once you bring people together for empowered conversation, they don't just talk and listen. Remember when I said there's verbal gifting? That's from what happens when people are heard. When people are heard well, it's the full circle back. Someone who's shared something goes, wow, thank you. You get it now. And that's meaningful to the person who shared something. That's why shift happens in this work, is when people are heard. Offenders cannot be fully responsible for their actions until they gain a responsibility from learning how their actions have affected others. Once you cleverly split that word into 2 words, now you have to think about what are the spaces that increase that ability. Well, they have to hear new content. They have to hear story content. What did people experience? Widen their zone so their life isn't just about themselves. And that's how people shift who have been in offending patterns from negative responsibility for what they've done to positive responsibility for making things go. Recovery world is all about this, isn't it? Another framing is ownership, empathy, reparation. I mentioned when I went into the jail, I would focus my conversations on these three things. Traditionally, we kind of like to go from ownership to reparation kind of quickly, guilt, punishment. But restorative processes take the longer path through empathy because that's where there's an internalization and motivation dynamic that happens. Even with a 14-year-old, you get a 14-year-old that builds the competency of empathy, that's huge for them to not recidivate and get into the system. That's really a big reason why this work needs to be supported at all levels. This is kind of a same language in a linear fashion. I outline my meetings according to this outline. Simpler words. If you go through my trainings, we talk about stories, we talk about impacts, and if that's, if that's deep enough, then people can talk about repairs into the future. So that's by intention. We want people in a condensed conversation to move from past, present to future. How many people get stuck in the past with their emotions and trapped there? That we want people to shift out of that. So if that's deep enough talk about all things past and present, then shift will happen at that point in a meeting and people relax. Then they talk about the future. You're getting my condensed training here right today. And that's where shift happens. Just a couple other slides and then we're done here. We kind of think that restorative justice, is about bringing these people together. It's not. It's not just, for folks that might end up on Oprah. It's for anybody. What I define restorative justice is it's helping people to move forward in life, whether or not they come together, which means other conversation partners, friends, surrogates, people who've had similar experiences. This is why it's working very well in prisons, because you can have all sorts of conversations with other people that's still deep in healing. And this isn't just about intervention models. Healthy communities will do this work in a prevention way. Just talking about, like in schools, let's talk about bullying or teasing. So you don't have to wait for an incident to do this deep work. All sorts of widening contexts now beyond just the criminal justice realm. Even historical harms and race relations. There's more and more innovation that's happening in these areas that's having intentional spaces that are meaningful to people. I'm really flying through this. You could have like a whole day on just historical harms and restorative work. Here's a biblical touch point. Just one of many verses about unity in the epistles. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. We read this language all the time, but think about this as a prompt for practicing hard conversations in a church. Because I think that's kind of, and I'm almost done, then I'm going to come right to you there. These are all sorts of areas where I think facilitators can help hold space beyond just traditional harms, divisive issues, clashing interests, tangled communications, lingering hurts, unintentional biases. There's probably another 5 we could fold in here. And why do emotions have to get all wrapped up with these? It's hard to be human. I split restorative work for churches between missional practices, intergroup practices, like a conservative liberal issue, kind of in the mid-zone, and then communal practices where you might need to be real and have a heart-to-heart with one other person in this congregation. Matthew 18. So there's a spectrum there of doing justice outwardly, but if we're going to have peace and justice go out from the church, shouldn't we also have it come into the church? And that's hard, but important for our integrity. That's just kind of a final phrase here. Hold space for hard but healing conversations where people can deeply share, deeply listen, and be deeply heard. So facilitators learn the arts of holding this space. And from this, people connect more with the humanity of the other person and envision new opportunities to coexist together. Could that even happen with liberal conservative issues and culture war issues? Anyone know about Braver Angels? I think they're a practical example of really trying to help with new coexistence models. And it's all about building trust in the heart zone. Without trust, it's really hard to be with people that you don't trust for whatever reasons. All right. It's time to have a question and discussion, and even if you have to leave at a certain time, others can stick around. I'll stick around as long as you wish for conversation.
This is really, really important work in the church and outside of the church. As I'm listening, I'm wondering if there is work being done with white-collar criminals, classing, where it's not just the teenagers or those in prisons, but what about that whole group as well?
Yeah, if you didn't hear, she's asking, can this work apply to white-collar crimes and even internationally, like where there's corporate bribery and then corporations and political. I don't personally know of examples. I've heard of a tiny bit, but this is where the field widens and people kind of imagine how can this kind of be applied. I do know, like in Colorado, you know how many injury law billboards there are up now? Why are they so common now, injury law? Well, there's restorative teams in Colorado that are trying to bring restorative work into the injury law realm. But it takes work, We're a competitive, litigative society, and we really don't understand this win-win approach to things. Wow, good. Let's go here. Oh, we need the mic to go around. Thanks.
Thank you. Just a footnote, a couple of comments, actually. There were Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in both Sierra Leone and Liberia post the two civil wars of the 1990s. They weren't as successful as the one in South Africa, but they did hold those. And then this church has a history with restorative justice. I can think back to an event that I went, it was a fundraiser, probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I think it was put together by the very talented Mariana Schulstad. And one of the things that I remember about that was there are a lot of cops there who are giving testimonials about the effectiveness of restorative justice. I mean, it was really wonderful just to hear from the law enforcement people about that.
That's great. Thanks for testifying to the church's history with that, and then law enforcement investment. Beautiful. Let's go way in the back, and then we'll come up to the front.
I'm wondering about the two young men that you spoke about earlier. Did this experience of them going through restorative justice alter their lives? Have they been successful?
That's a really good question. The year after I did that work, I ended up moving from Wisconsin to Duluth. So normally I would have had more history and tracking their developments. So I don't personally know how things played out. I do know that generally speaking, it's still challenging, the whole recidivism thing. It's still a challenge because there's lots of other life factors that can pull someone down or keep them in chronic habits. But what I do know of that case is that they came back into good standing in their local community with their parents who knew all the church folk, and that allowed them to just be able to be around there.
A follow-up to what Mary Kay said. It occurs to me that one barrier to this might be what we all swim in, which is the domination system and the grading people according to how much power, money, prestige, whatever they have. I'm thinking that if you're higher up on that domination system, you might be less motivated to do this because you kind of like where you're at. I don't know. It's just a thought.
It's a great observation, and part of the mediation world is to balance power differentials. So I've done meetings like with a 16-year-old and a school principal, and that's tricky because there's power in the room. So in a way, there's just different ways to help that 16-year-old feel like they're supported enough to be real and honest. But when you get into systemic issues of, systemic injustice, you're totally right. There's very little incentive. Even in South Africa, it was optional for people who had committed violence within the apartheid system to come forward. Most of them did not. So that's always a question, like where are the supports and incentives for people with power to participate? Because it involves vulnerability, right? It involves a very explicit vulnerability. You're already vulnerable from a crime, whether you're a victim or an offender. Now you're going to be vulnerable coming into a process where you're invited to be real. But as people of faith, we know that choosing into vulnerability is actually a pathway into strength, into redemption.
I have a question for you relating to a policy I became aware of in the corrections system. I dealt with a number of murder cases as a prosecutor over the years, and one of the things that I've learned is that when the murderer, the defendant is in prison, one of the treatments, one of the parts of their counseling is having them write an apology to the survivors of whoever it was that they killed. And I've seen some very persuasive ones written, but the prison authorities will not allow those apologies go to the survivors unless the survivor specifically asks for it. I've questioned in my mind the wisdom of that, the rationale for that, and I guess it becomes a question, is it wise in your business to impose an apology upon people if it's there, if they don't want to hear it, and can it be helpful in that circumstance?
Really, really, really good questions. I actually am a personal friend with the state coordinator of those apology letters right now. He lives in Duluth. So I'd almost like to have you communicate some of your wisdom to him. And it is a shame that these letters are written and then they're put in a shelf. What that means is we have work to do to support and educate victimized people to know the life-giving opportunities that are available to them. Because on the offender side, these possibilities are there, but traditional systems still kind of block the goodness of their communication to go further. So I see that as a fruitful area for work in Minnesota.
What would be the rationale for the policy?
Protectiveness, a prosecutor mindset. We don't want the victim to be, and that's a good impulse. So it just means that more work has to be done on the preparatory side, where they're feeling dignified in their journey, and then someone can say, by the way, there are these letters, and when your time is appropriate. I know Marshall might want to speak to this issue, so let's have him chime in on this.
Yeah, one of the reasons that one of the reasons that they might not want those letters to go to the victims is the victim has to be ready for that. If it might be a mandatory thing for the prisoner to write that letter, but the victims of the family might not be ready to receive that letter. You know, it might be beneficial to them, it might not be beneficial to them at the time. It just might bring back a memory that they don't need to be remembering at that moment. Should I tell my story now?
Why don't you just give like a snapshot, because I think to honor your story, Marshall, there should almost be like a whole nother Sunday. I mean, really, I'm sure, but I think it's important for you to just say a short bit so people know who you are. And
Okay. Well, I did 31 years in prison. I've been a part of this church for 10 years, and I was surprised this church accepted me the way it did. And one of my big things of this church is that, you know, I became a very honest person. You know, and honesty is my policy right now. And I've been real open with people, and I've really loved this place. But I have stories, and I'm real open, and if anybody has any questions they want to ask me, then they can do that, because I like it here.
Thank you. Okay, Jim, I know you had your hand up.
We have somewhat of a natural experiment going on in Hennepin County right now. We have quite a substantial increase in property crime and car thefts, as we all know, which has changed the tone of our neighborhoods actually quite a bit. And and Mary Moriarty has an idea, you know, these kids are too young, and so and other people out, hey, we got to put them in jail, and we're caught in this box. I'm sure all these kids would respond to this system. I mean, they're kids. She agrees with that too, but under the current system, if you let them off, they're reoffending in a nanosecond. How can we get this, slow that process down? Maybe it's already slowed down. I mean, we have good people in Hennepin County. We have good people in the city of Minneapolis, but we have this dilemma as our city is not the city it was prior to George Floyd and prior to the pandemic. And it's really noticeable throughout. And we need this, but how to get it implemented with these kids, particularly who, by the way, often have guns,
yeah.
which is a real problem.
So I'll try to give a succinct answer. There's two layers of response. The first layer, of course, is the prevention realm. What are the conditions this is happening, and what are some upstream things that can be done? But in terms of the intervention side, I really believe that government resources are always limited. Limited. Important, necessary, but limited, which means, like even in victim services, all of the resources go to the top, where the demand is highest, which means that in other kinds of crimes, like property crimes, there can be less resources and attention to it. I think that's a prime area for community resources to partner with government resources and carry more of a load, even with some money thrown at it, because there are places where volunteerism in this work can be really important and can be mobilized much quicker than even government programs. So the kind of programming that I've been involved with in nonprofits over the years is what I call a 50-50 partnership between government resources and community resources, often reflected with a 50-50 funding, to show that the community does have a place. And specifically, it would be volunteerism with paid staff coordination that can do mentoring, do this dialogue work, but it doesn't end there. There needs to be group work, there needs to be community service work. You know, you have to be in the lives of teenagers for a substantial amount of time. These aren't one-off things. So I hope that helps a bit. I think right behind you.
Yeah, unfortunately, we need to wrap up officially, but people can certainly stay and ask questions, but officially we need to end. And thanks everyone for coming today. I also wanted to let you know the scheduled talk for next week was about a program for churches through Augsburg that several members participated in. That's been delayed until next fall. And we're not sure what the topic will be next Sunday. So make sure you check your Friday email. Anyway, thank you, but please stay and ask questions. And clearly, this is a really rich topic.
Yeah, if I stick around, do we want still group discussion? Okay. Rice Lake, Barron County. Do you? Yeah.